Je pense sans cesse à toi.
Hello and welcome to The Foretop. It's a roundtable discussion of today's hot-button topics in food and beverage. I'm your host, Catherine Cole. We will start out episode 41 by discussing a food podcast with real teeth. Next, we will discuss the whitewashing of eating disorders. Finally, we'll gab about a new bodega concept that has not been well received. In the studios of OPB today, I'm joined by Ashley Duchemin, production manager at Bitch Media and producer of the Propaganda and Back Talk podcasts. Welcome, Ashley.
Hi.
And Emilly Prado, a freelance journalist and photographer who's also known as DJ Mommy Miami. Hi, Emilly.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for being here. And Juan Ramirez, producer of the Racist Sandwich podcast. Hey, Juan.
Hey, hi.
All right, well, let's bite into our first course. Remember when the food press limited itself to covering recipes, restaurants, culinary, travel, and celebrity chefs? Today, culinary coverage is much more comprehensive, with topics ranging from the minimum wage debate to the Me Too movement. And I would argue that food podcasts have been at the forefront of shaking up culinary media for the better. Juan Ramirez, your podcast, Racist Sandwich, tackles situations that are best understood when described in first person by the people who are actually experiencing them. So I'd love it if you could start us off by telling us a little bit about the Racist Sandwich podcast and the subject matter that you tend to cover.
So the Racist Sandwich podcast is a podcast on food, class, race, and gender. We cover, again, many of these subjects, and what's very, very interesting about the podcast is that, yes, it's more powerful when you hear it, or when you hear the stories that are coming from the person, the specific people. It makes it for a more real listen.
Absolutely. Just hearing people's experience firsthand. Part of the reason I actually started this podcast was I don't think this podcast tackles the issues as deeply as Racist Sandwich does, but just the idea that so much food media in previous years just seemed to be focused on celebrity chefs and recipes and restaurants, all of which are great, but I feel like there's a whole story of food that isn't being told. Did you feel that way? What inspired you and your co-host to launch the podcast?
Right. So Suleiho and Sahir, John Mohammed, and also Alan, which was our first producer, they launched the podcast because there wasn't that many people of color in the food media industry. And today there aren't many as well. So I mean, this is kind of like an outlet for people of color to create their own content, to produce, to make let their own stories be heard, and it doesn't necessarily need to be about, again, like you mentioned, the food celebrity chef, or the best restaurants with Michelin stars. We try to make our stories around what's behind all the Michelin stars. The cook, the dishwasher, the chef that is going through a rough time. Maybe some guests of restaurants who have gone through a pretty bad experience at one point. In general, we just try to focus our stories around the, Food Network style of content.
Yeah, I love the episode where you interviewed Armando Ibanez, who is an undocumented queer filmmaker who also works in the restaurant industry. And, these sorts of folks who are, working so hard in the industry and are actually have fascinating stories typically are not covered by mainstream food media.
Right. So Armando has a very interesting story because, he's an undocumented filmmaker, but he's also a server. So he, created his own web series around his story. A queer server, and I think that's very, very interesting because you get to hear or you get to see a different perspective of what people think goes on at restaurants. Like, for example, Armando, right, gets to tell his own story on how he goes to find the work that he does. So, going to a place to get a fake green card, so then he can work quote unquote legally at a restaurant. Having a double, triple identity, being queer, being undocumented, and not talking about that in with his coworkers at the restaurant in the web series. So I think it's very complex. These conversations are very complex, and you have to have an ear and come in with a very open mind to these sort of topics, to these sort of conversations. That's kind of what we want to get at.
Yeah. Ashley, the Bitch Media podcast, particularly the Propaganda podcast, focus on food, I would say, every couple months, every few months?
Every now and then we focus on food, but sometimes it doesn't always feel like it's necessarily about the food itself, but about the story behind it. And so Propaganda does that a lot. And we recently did that in an episode with Solejo, who actually just joined us as our new host of Propaganda. She also hosts Racist Sandwich, as Juan just said. And that episode was really great because she had on people who are talking about like how Native American people have been able to control their food. She interviewed a food writer who was on SNAP growing up, or food stamps. And then she also talked to Rini Gregor, who talked about the problem of the idea of clean eating and how food bloggers tend to encourage disordered eating.
Mm-hmm. We've talked about the clean eating, the clean eating, the problem with clean eating on this show as well.
Yeah, I think it was really interesting. She was talking about how she had been on a panel to talk about like the positives, negatives of clean eating, and there was a food blogger there a very coveted food blogger, and so Rini basically wanted to talk about like the problems with that and how it could cause disordered eating, and the audience kind of turned on her and was defending this food blogger and basically saying she just wants us to eat healthy, So what's the problem with that? And I think Rini does a really good job at explaining what the problem with that is on this episode specifically, and I won't give too much away.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Did that the guests, did they also write an article, I think, in the Washington Post?
Yes,
I read that article because a lot of what they were doing is not only telling the person or telling, that this other clean eater or whatever wasn't rooting her diet and stuff in facts. So a lot of the time she was telling people, cut out all bread and things like that when there are nuances that weren't being reflected. Yeah,
and one of the things that she said was like, if you can avoid going out to eat with friends, then do that. And what Rini says is like, food is so much more than just like nourishment. It's about this social aspect. It is about being out with friends and family. And if you cut that out, then that's not a healthy relationship with food.
I mean, that's just crazy.
I can imagine. Yeah, I'm vegan and like it's hard to eat out and I still go to places and I'm like, okay, fine, I'll take the salad. I don't want to eat it, but I won't avoid going out because of that. And I can't imagine like just not going out because most people around me are not vegan too,
Yeah, and that kind of brings home the point that, food it's foremost in the news so often, and it's something that really affects all of us personally within our lives. And I think that's kind of what Racist Sandwich gets. It gets at both of those things. And I feel like so much of food media just doesn't even go there. It's all just like, look at this fabulous dinner served al fresco in a vineyard. And I shouldn't say that. I'm a wine writer, so I shouldn't have said. But it's like this aspirational lifestyle thing where, most human beings, especially in the United States, their interaction with food is very fraught, very political. It's very personal. And I love how Racist Sandwich just addresses those issues.
Yeah, I think food hits you in all aspects, right? Like in all aspects of life. it'll affect you whether you're poor, whether you're rich, whether you're a person of color, whether you're white. It'll affect you in some sort of way. For example, let's talk about immigration, right? A lot of the people that cultivate our foods, many of them are undocumented immigrants in the fields. That first of all, that's the root of where food comes from, correct? Like that's a lot of that California, Oregon, many of the southern states, they're big. Their state budget mostly comes from agriculture. A lot of the time, so a part of the budget comes from agriculture. So if let's say if mass deportations are happening and if mass undocumented people are getting arrested, that's going to affect those types of jobs. So agriculture will be affected. If agriculture is affected, then restaurants are affected. If restaurants are affected, then there's all a variety of things that happen. It's like a chain effect, right? So there's many things that food will affect you in all sorts of ways in all walks of life. So it's a thing that unites all of us, I guess, in a sense.
Mm-hmm. And even in art and literature, I mean, Emily, you actually, I love how this is kind of this beautiful circle where everyone's kind of done work with each other here. Emily, you interviewed the author Carmen Maria Machado for the Racist Sandwich podcast recently. And her work is just so fascinating. It's, could you describe her work and kind of her thoughts on food, her point of view when she's writing about food?
Yeah, that's a big question.
Sorry. I know.
Okay. So,
do it in 10 seconds.
From my perspective, I believe that her work is really, it's really gripping, and there's it's complex and layered like food. Some of the stories revolve around food, while others are more about explorations of love and queerness. And I'm specifically referring to her collection of short stories, Her Body and Other Parties, that just came out.
And it was nominated for the National Book Award.
Yeah, and she also just got some other awards. She's
been getting a lot of
winning
buzz.
all the awards, yeah, as she should. But yeah, so Racist Sandwich approached me and asked me if I would interview her, and I was really excited to do that. And it's funny because I actually worked with Bitch before too. That's where I got my start. So we're very much all intermixed in the same world in different iterations. But yeah, a lot of what we talked about on the show, in addition to her work, was about the intergenerational effects actually of disordered eating and how family can play a role into that. And I know that you were going to maybe bring this up already, but yeah. I wrote an article a while back for Marie Claire in the summer critiquing a film that came out on Netflix, To the Bone is what it was called. And specifically, I was just critiquing it because I'm just tired of watching rich white girls struggle. That was the subtext for it. But a lot of the conversations around eating disorders, like conversations around the food industry in general, are focused on the dominant perspective, and that doesn't take into account the intersections of race and gender, like the Racist Sandwich podcast talks about.
Yeah. And that is our next topic. So, yeah, Emily, can you tell us a little bit about this Netflix film? It starred Lily Collins, and it was called To the Bone. What was the premise of it, and what was your response? I mean, you kind of just told us, but a little more detail.
Yeah, so basically there's a girl who has an eating disorder. She's had several experiences going to an inpatient treatment center. This is her next one, and the film starts with her kind of bragging about, this is like my 5th one I've been kicked out of. How about you? And there's like a lot of competition, it seems like, between how many times you can, get kicked out of the system. And while there is truth to, people who have eating disorders don't want to stop doing it often because it's a sense of control and a sense of power. But as someone who did suffer or does suffer from an eating disorder, at its height, I was in high school. I have a single mom. She wasn't home much. She wasn't there to pay attention to me. Even when I decided that I knew something was wrong and I knew I needed to get help for it, I researched some inpatient facilities, and they're really expensive and we couldn't afford it. And so I knew I just had to, pull myself up by my bootstraps and figure it out. And so to see someone in a film kind of glorifying the ability to just go through these residential treatment centers and see that narrative over and over and over, I was tired of it, and I wanted to write about it. And I got actually a lot of backlash about it.
Really?
Yeah, a ton.
What was the backlash you got?
Because I brought up race, and it's something that people don't want to talk about. When I mention race, a lot of times what I'm saying isn't taken into consideration or is discredited or whatever. And the realities are the situation is different depending on what your background is, whether that's your race or your gender, especially your class, which is what this critique was. It was a combination of those intersections and a combination from my experience.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's so interesting because ethnicity is so closely tied with the way people judge each other's eating. Juan, I think your new producer, Stephanie Kuo, had a piece in the Dallas Observer.
Right.
About, remind me, it was about Asian fusion restaurants owned by white folks.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But she made that really interesting point about growing up and having Chinese food in her lunch as a kid and having other people judging her and that feeling. That's
So the thing is, here, and I hear it from a lot of Asian Americans, a lot of folks from the Asian continent, is that the food is why a lot of the times they get ostracized in school, especially at a very young age. Being Mexican, Mexican food is it's, I guess, not Americanized, but it's accepted in the American dietary, right? I never had those sort of problems growing up, right? Really, for me at least, it gives me from an outside perspective some real thought into this. I didn't come to the States until I was 10 years old, so the first time I had Asian food, I can remember that. The first time I had Chinese food, I can remember that. So I didn't grow up with eating those types of food, but so for me, listening to the writers and write about this, it's very interesting, and it saddens me, that they had to go through this, and it's kind of like a rite of passage because a lot of the folks that I speak to, they have the same experience. If you've seen the new show by David Chang, Ugly Delicious, on Netflix, and one of the episodes, he basically and it's called I think that episode's called Ugly Delicious, and he talks about home food and how growing up, he basically got teased at and got laughed at by peers at school when he was young because of the food that his parents would make, though, So, and now that Korean food in particular is one of those popular foods that is coming up, the wave of Korean food. He sees that as kind of like a slap in the face, because there's all this millennials, specifically white millennials, that are creating this other conversation of Asian food. When they've never really had to deal with the backlash from years before. So I think it's a very interesting conversation when you hear it from the perspective of people that were oppressed in the past, and to see that other people are monetizing of those type of foods.
Yeah. So, Emily, I'm curious, in your piece you talk about the Eurocentric beauty ideals that tie in with anorexia and eating disorders. I mean, was part of the trigger for you a feeling of pressure to fit in with the community where you lived? I think you mentioned in your piece that it was a mostly white town that you grew up in.
Yeah, actually. So, Juan, you grew up in LA, so I think the food culture there is probably very different from different parts of the country specifically. I grew up in a town that was predominantly white folks, and I mentioned specifically in the piece that it's predominantly middle upper class folks. When I grew up, the average age was 65, and the average income was about that $65,000 for a household, which was nothing near my experience. But yeah, so it was frustrating to see again, she's a thin white girl, and that's something, there was a male character, which was pushing the envelope a little bit. And then there was, I think there was like a fat black woman who her disordered eating was overeating. So,
this isn't To the Bone.
Yeah. So there were a few different narratives that were shown. But in my house, too, like, I actually want to write an essay about this because growing up, I was called flaca, which is skinny girl. Mm-hmm. And in Mexican culture, it's very common to have nicknames that you give, like, to everyone. And so it's been a really interesting shift to have that identity and have that nickname and lose that because my body doesn't reflect that anymore. And in my own household, it wasn't that ideal was necessarily upheld, but it was something that was frequently commented on whether I'm going to family parties. Even now, I'll go to family parties, and even my grandma, who I'm like, she's super progressive and awesome, will sit here and comment about my body like it's a positive thing if it looks like I've lost weight. And yeah, it's just something that, there's another layer to it there that isn't discussed really in most mainstream narratives of eating disorders now. And I'd like to change that.
Well, I was going to say that your interview with Carmen Maria Machado really hit home for me because I think, I love you, Mommy, please don't be mad, but my relationship with my mom has really affected the way that I view my body. And like, basically because like growing up, I was always like bigger than everybody else, whether that was taller or thicker or whatever. I loved food. I ate all of it. I'm much more picky now than I was then. And so growing up, I heard a lot of like, like I was called fat all the time. And like, with my mom, I don't think that she meant to like perpetuate that either. Like she's very much like a loving, like really caring mother. But like being Dominican, there's an ideal, there's a skinny waist, a big butt, and you have to be thin and then still have like these curves. And so I didn't have that. I more have like the body type of like my father's side of the family. And I spent like from the time I was 12, I dieted. I like, deprived myself. Like there were a couple months where I was like, I'm not kidding. I only had Mountain Dew and pork rinds because there were no carbs. And like my mom had taught me that like if you don't eat carbs, you lose weight, right? Mm. And I was 15 and I don't know any different. And so like when you had that interview, it really, struck home for me because I wish I could go back to that person and be like, you don't have to like look like this. And you're never going to look like this. And you don't need to look like this, And like even like the other day, I'm talking to my mom and Dominican again, like certain body type, and you go to DR to get a Brazilian butt lift, get a tummy tuck, whatever. And my mom told me that I should get a tummy tuck because I don't have a waist, right? And she doesn't mean it. Yeah, she doesn't mean it. But, I think that like Dominican culture and like Latin culture is very much like based around like your relationship to food and the size of your body is very important to the way that you present to the world. And so...
So you're not just dealing with the American media Barbie doll, ideal. Then you have to also deal with the Dominican ideal. And it's like,
yes,
coming at you from all different directions.
Yeah, it's coming at me. I mean, I think like when it comes at me from other people, of course, that has been hurtful over my life. But like, oh, Mommy, I love you. When it comes from my mom, it's really tough for me because I know that like part of the reason that she talks about that is because she sees herself that way too. Like she would do it if she could too. And she just wants the best for me. She wants to be happy with my body, and she knows that I never have been. And so like you also touched on that in your piece To the Bone about like how there's a different type of body type when you are around Latin communities. And I grew up in New York, I grew up in Brooklyn. And so I was surrounded a lot by like Black and Latin communities. And there's a certain ideal. And I do think like, I didn't see the other side of that because I didn't grow up around a lot of white people. But I still feel like those, even if it's curvy, like there's still like these Eurocentric things that you're supposed to have too. Like I have light skin. So, that's something that has been coveted. And like, I am white passing. And so like that's looked at as good too. So it just, everything that you wrote in there really like hit home for me. And your interview with Carmen was just really like, yes, I've never heard someone else talk about this type of relationship with their mother that's so similar to like what I had growing up and what I still have.
Yeah, and one thing too that I even want to talk with her more about, there just wasn't enough time, but was specifically in that piece that she wrote, which if you haven't read that piece I'm referring to, it's called 10 Bites. But her mother is talking, badly about her body, and there's a part where she says, the character from which this story is told, but where she questions, if you feel that way about your own body, how do you feel about my body? Because my body is what you are talking about hating, essentially, in much more eloquent words, because it's Carmen Maria Machado. But that's what she says in essence. And that for me too, growing up, even if it wasn't directed at me, there was my mom talking about her own body, which is hurtful and just hurts me not only like on a personal level, because then I think about my own body, but it hurts me to see that internalization of these Eurocentric beauty ideals, whether they're rooted in the watered down versions or different iterations of it within Latinidad or actual straight European ideals.
Yeah. I mean, like as a male too, that also happens with males. Like and I'm gonna go with my family as well too. I've always been el flaco, the skinny guy in the family, and I can remember me trying to eat like super unhealthy to trying to gain weight when I was a teenager, and it just never happened. I never gained weight, so I used to live with my dad in Los Angeles and would come up and visit my mom here in Portland, and every time we would come up here, they would mention like, "Oh, estás bien flaco. Oh, you're very skinny. Like, like what are you eating back home, back in LA? What's your dad giving you?" And that always like hit me. Like, I've always been a very slim person, and I remember trying to like gain weight, like do weights or but I never gained muscle. And I guess as age is hitting, I'm gaining a little bit. And now I'm like, hey, Mom, look at me now. And she's like, no, you're still skinny, son. But I mean, it's kind of like in our, it's part of like our I guess our cultural thought, because like, I mean, for example, there's that show El Gordo y la Flaca on national TV, which is, the fat guy and the skinny woman, right? And that's like, in if you see some of the episodes, there are like, they treat El Gordo bad sometimes as a joke, because he's like an overweight guy. They make him go through like rigorous activities where he can't really handle it, and it's kind of like meant to be a joke, and then that's passing in the culture. And so there's that conversation that we're not having as well within our own selves and within our own families. Fortunately for me, like I've already had that conversation with my mom, and like we've come to to an agreement that, hey, look, listen, that's wrong to direct to someone in those ways, in that term, or to look at someone because of their body image or their body shape. But then again, like I really sat down with her and had that conversation in like real terms. Like, hey, Mom, this is for real. This is serious, and we're gonna get to the bottom of this.
I had those conversations with my mom too, especially recently, because I do want to get plastic surgery, and maybe that's why she suggested a different type of one. But damn, but I've had these conversations with her because it's just commonplace. There are many people within my family who have gone to Colombia, gone to DR, did things with their body to help themselves feel better about it. And so I told my mom, I have a specific person who's like a close family friend who's going to do that soon. And my mom was talking about how this person had their 15-year-old daughter there while they were having these conversations. And I said to her, I wish that I could go back and take those conversations out of my mind. And I don't think it's healthy for you to be having those type of conversations in front of her daughter. Because this woman is fine. She doesn't need this work, but she wants to have it done. And so if her daughter is already like, I want a nose job, I want this, I want that. And she's 15 years old. And I remember being that 15-year-old. But when I have these conversations with my mom, I think because, like you were saying, like this is the way that they feel about their body, it's hard for her to be able to sympathize with the other side of it, because in her mind, it's like, well, everybody does it, who cares? And I wish that we could get to the bottom of it, where I would just be like, we don't need to have these conversations anymore. Let's not talk about it in front of the kids. Let's not talk about it at all. Like when someone, I think I don't know if this is true for Mexican communities, but with Dominicans, when you walk through the door, the first thing is like, you've gotten skinny, you've gotten fat, you look good in that outfit. Man, your body makes the outfit, you know? And I just wish that that wasn't the case. It's like the minute you come through the door, you look good, you lost weight. And I don't know what it will take to change that, like to make that shift, because I think it's so ingrained in like in Latinx culture, you know?
And there's totally a way to say you look good without being like, you look skinny, you look good, you know? Just be like, you look good.
Yeah, you look good. Your makeup looks great. Like, come on.
Cool dress.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, and teens put enough pressure on themselves already. They don't need mom, you know, weighing in as well.
Yeah, or grandma or your aunt. Like, it's just everybody. Like, you walk into a door and there's a table full of women and they're all like, maybe you don't look that great today. You know?
Yeah.
Well, I think this is all, boils down to the idea of like needing to decolonize your mind. And I want to give a shout out to Nalgona Positivity Pride, run by Gloria Lucas, who does a lot of really great work at the intersections of eating disorder and race and ethnicity and culture. And so like a lot of these conversations are boiling down to us being able to, through education and through reading and, all these things, being able to realize that those conversations contribute to poor self-esteem and like terrible thoughts. And a lot of times our families don't see the role that they play in perpetuating that. It's just seen as normal.
I mean, there's the abuelita, right, that always wants to feature, right? Like there's that like, the grandma, she always wants to feature. She always wants to, like, oh, mijo, you don't look good. You want some, we want something to eat, or you look, skinny. Let me make you something to eat. I mean, in a sense, it's something that's comforting because you want that to come from your grandmother. Yeah. But then, it's also like, I guess it's kind of like the silver lining, right? Like, is it perpetuating that, like, that eating, disorder or like that like body image, right? Yeah. Or is it like your grandma just being, abuelita being, grandma?
And Juan, hearing what you have to say reminds me too that, Emily, your piece, it hit home in another way in that, like, we never talk about the fact that men have eating disorders too, It's not just white women. It's not just, bourgeois white young women who have eating disorders. It hits every community, and that includes men. And why don't we talk about this?
Well, for a long time, actually, in the medical community, it was thought that women of color couldn't have, or communities of color couldn't have eating disorders. Not until the 90s did that change and that research take place. So it's something that's, again, like many things, a systemic and historically rooted in oppressive thought.
Oh my goodness! Well, this has been such an interesting conversation, but we got to keep moving so we get everything talked about before our time runs out. And I do want to move on to our third course, the Bodega Backlash. Back in episode 20, we discussed the new and futuristic Amazon Go grocery store where there are no checkout lines and no registers. And I think it was over the summer there was an announcement that there was a Silicon Valley-based business called Bodega that purports to pack an entire convenience store into a single automated unit. And Ashley Duchemin, you were on a Bitch Media panel that I thought was super interesting, so I wanted to discuss this. You guys talked about this Silicon Valley startup called Bodega that kind of seems to be like this misguided attempt to make the American corner store obsolete. So maybe you can start us off and just explain what the concept was and what the controversy was.
Absolutely. So basically, former Google employees Paul McDonald and Ashwath Rajan came up with an idea that essentially an automatic like vending machine, right? So basically you get an app, the app allows you to access the box, and then there are these computer-powered cameras that actually can tell which product you've picked up from the box, and then you're automatically charged. So it's the same exact concept as the Amazon Go store. It's just in a smaller version of that, right? And the boxes themselves are like these 5 by 5 foot wide boxes or something like that. And so this announcement came out in September 2017. I remember it very, very distinctly because Fast Company titled the piece where, we first heard about it, 2 ex-Googlers want to make bodegas and mom-and-pop corner stores obsolete, right? And so I think, like, just immediately from the title, anybody who, like, lives in New York, who's from a Latinx community, or around the country, like, you're automatically jumping on that and being like, what the hell, right?
Bodega is sacred.
Right. A bodega is sacred. And so the reason why this is so controversial is for two reasons. One, they named this vending machine, bodega, right? Which is a Spanish word. It's normally known for corner stores or convenience stores in usually urban, low-income communities, specifically Latinx communities, but all over. And two, they made the logo a bodega cat. And so, it's a cat. You would think this is not a contentious issue in pop culture, but it is, right? And I'll get back to that. But so the reason why this is a problem really is because I looked up this survey from the Bodega Association of the U.S., right? They did an NYC Bodegas owners survey, and 85% of bodegas are Latinx owned, and this is from a survey of 16,500 bodegas, right? 61% consider their business in risk of closing now or in the near future. Okay, 61%. And 83% of that is because of higher rents and unreasonable lease terms, right? And so these Silicon Valley types are coming up with this box that is supposed to make these mom and pop stores obsolete, right? And they say that this came out of admiration. And
neither of them are from the Latinx community either.
No. But you know what? And I mentioned this in the roundtable too. One of them is Indian American, and there are many Indian American immigrant-owned bodegas in New York. So I think that was just an extra slap in the face, really. These Silicon Valley types, they are coming with connections, with resources, with the money to be able to come up with this thing that is supposed to be in admiration of these stores. But if you're trying to come up with something that is celebrating something, why wouldn't you uplift the thing that you are admiring? Why would you take your resources to try to put that thing out of business when they're already in danger? And so that was their apology basically said that. And that was one of the things that just made my skin crawl, that they positioned it that way. But on top of that, the reason that these bodegas are in danger is because of gentrification. Right. So New York, I'm from Brooklyn, I'm from East New York. It is a very poor neighborhood, is known for that and for being dangerous and all this other stuff. And gentrification hasn't reached my neighborhood yet, but it's very close. It's in Bushwick, which is just one neighborhood over. And basically people, all of the communities that live there that are usually POC, my neighborhood specifically is Black and Latinx, they're being run out because of raising rents, because of these high rises, which these vending machines would go into, because of the gyms, because of the Whole Foods, because of, these coffee shops, wherever they're going to put these things. These people are already being pushed out. So we know that you are not catering to the community of the thing that you're admiring. The community that this thing is serving, you are not there for them. You're there for somebody else, and you don't care what happens to that community. They're just more than kind of what we were talking about earlier. It's more than food and access. It's about family. It's about knowing these people there. Yeah. When I was a kid, my bodega guy was my neighborhood watch. I couldn't do anything without my father knowing, because he would tell, So this is, it's just so much bigger.
You're saying a vending machine can't do that?
Right. I mean, it has those cameras, so maybe it will.
Face recognition.
Yeah. So
no beer and cigarettes for you. Not that these things even sell. I have to say, anyone who's lived in New York or a big city where bodegas are a thing, I just saw the pictures of what they have in these vending machines, and it's vitamin water and Cliff Bars. When I would go to bodegas, it was not for healthy stuff. I'm sorry.
Yeah, and also that was something that I was going to bring up too. That the types of things that they're putting in here, supposedly it's supposed to be for the convenience of whoever's in the building, so they'll cater it to whoever's there, right? But when people go to these bodegas, the ones that you admire, but are going to make obsolete with this, they're going for products that they can't find elsewhere. Coming from New York to Portland was the hardest transition. There is not one Dominican restaurant here. It's hard. I have a very specific type of pigeon peas that I could get at any bodega in New York that I can't find here at all, no matter where I go. I would have to go on Amazon and buy it for $13 for a can of beans that I could have went to the store and got for $1 at a bodega. And so, they're not catering to these communities.
Yeah, and when I visited New York for the first time a few years ago, I was poor, and I got to use my food stamps at all the bodegas to get sandwiches at 3 a.m.
Yeah.
That's the best part.
Where are those sandwiches now? You know, or can you pay with food stamps if you're actually there to be accessible and to be serving the community? Is that something that you're building into your model? Which is no.
Right.
Yeah, that's a great point, especially...
So, bodegas are an East Coast thing. In LA, we don't really call them bodegas. There's no word for bodegas. We just call them la marqueta, the market, or the corner store. And it's a very similar concept as well, too. But I got to say that the New York bodegas, they're more lively.
Yeah.
I used to live in Washington Heights in Manhattan. And there's a bodega on Amsterdam and 171st, around that area. And I got to say, going to that bodega after several months, I was there for about a year, it was phenomenal. People knew me, like the person at the bodega, the cashier, he was there all the time. There was a cat. There was 2 cats, and it was more like family. It was more like your neighbor, like you go into your neighbor's store, right? So people already know who you are. If they haven't seen you in a while, like where you been, those type of questions. They already know what you were gonna buy because you bought the same thing all the time. You know what I'm saying? So there was like that familiarity with your bodega, because that was my bodega, right? Like that, you kind of own it, right? And that's one of the things that I don't think a machine could bring you.
Absolutely not. And that just reminded me, especially when I was a college student and I would go to this bodega in Harlem, the guy knew me, and I came in every day for jalapeno Cheetos. It's okay.
Yeah, it's interesting. Living in a big city can be strangely lonely.
Yeah.
Having lived in New York and Chicago and Boston myself. Yeah, and Emily, you made the point that, a lot of them are open all night. And just that feeling where, if you're studying or whatever, you're up all night, you go in at 2 a.m. and someone has a big smile for you and talks to you. It is that feeling of community that you were talking about, Juan, that you can't replace that.
Definitely. And specifically with that bodega, if I didn't have money for something that day, I was good. Any bodega that was mine. If I couldn't afford it that day, I could come back and pay for it later. And that is such, for the communities that are living there, for these, Dominican and Puerto Rican and all these people who are owning these bodegas, there's a trust there because these people are just like your family. They're basically your family. You see them, you know them, and you can relate to them. And this box is not going to give me that.
Yeah, I felt seen immediately when I went in, and you're like, hola, mamita, ¿qué te doy? I'm like, okay, yeah, you got me, you know me, you see me.
Yeah.
I hate to wrap this up, but we are running out of time, so I think it is time to move on to dessert, where we each share something food or beverage related that we've been enjoying this week. I'll quickly go first. Just relating to some of the topics we talked about today, I want to recommend a recent episode of the Eater Upsell podcast that ran fairly recently, in which the feminist author Jessica Valenti interviews Lindy West, who's a New York Times columnist and author of the book Shrill. I just discovered her writing when she wrote for Jezebel. She's just hilarious, outspoken, wonderful writer. And they talked about the concept of performative eating, which is kind of something we touched on today here. And Lindy talks about herself as being, she uses the term fat person, and the feeling of when you go to a restaurant, everyone's judging what you're ordering and watching you as you eat and are you really going to finish that? And it was just a really compelling interview to listen to. And so I recommend everyone who loves podcasts go and listen to that one. Ashley, did you bring a dessert item for us?
I did. So this is my dessert item this week and every week. It is Woke Foods. It's a plant-based Dominican food cooperative in Washington Heights, founded by 2 Afro-Indigenous Dominican women, Marilis Catalina and Isanet Batista. And basically, they are looking to highlight the healing traditions of Dominican food through recipe sharing, cooking classes, meal planning, and catering, and they are actually looking for people to join them. So if you're interested in that, and you should join.
Cool. Emily, did you bring something?
Yeah, so mine's just a dish that I want people to hop on. So when Racist Sandwich launched their Kickstarter, one of the prizes, or what are they called? Rewards. One of the rewards was an elote. And people really like elote. But I just want to give a quick shout out to esquites, which are really the underdog. Esquites are elote that have usually just been boiled, and they're served in a styrofoam cup usually.
Okay, so for those of us who don't know what either one of those things are, can you back up and describe?
Okay. Yeah, so, esquites are cups of...
It's like corn on a cob.
Yeah, so it's
cleaned. I don't know.
Okay, corn kernels that are boiled and served, typically boiled. Sometimes they can be grilled, but they're typically served in a little styrofoam cup in their own natural juice that they've just been boiled in. And then you top it with heaps of either sour cream or mayonnaise and queso cotija, maybe some chili powder and hot sauce. They're really good. Their cousin, I would say, elotes, are more commonly seen. It's a Mexican street food, and it's the corn that's grilled. I've just been eating them a lot lately, and I've been learning how to prepare them. It's really simple, and they're just really delicious, so people should try them if they haven't. And sometimes they'll be in little Mexican paleterias where they sell, like, popsicles, and under the name of elotes en vaso. So shout out to esquites.
And we're moving into corn season. That sounds really good. Juan, what did you bring for us?
Speaking of rewards, actually, one of the rewards we had to do, was recipes, right? And my mom was a street vendor for a very long time. Actually, since I can remember, she used to sell ceviches. We used to live in Puerto Escondido. It's a small southern state in the state of Oaxaca, and it's a beach town, so ceviche, seafood, it's a huge thing. The other thing that she would sell were tortitas de plátano, and they're like banana, plantain little pancakes, cake style. They're really, really good. Basically, is batter plantain with a little bit of flour. Then you deep fry it into kind of like or you shape it into kind of like a pancake, and then you deep fry that, and then you serve that with concentrated milk. Really, really good. Depending on what kind of la lechera, depending on what kind of which is a brand of the milk, but it depends how much sugar you want on it. It tastes really, really good. It's on the rewards.
I want some. Now I'm starving, you guys. Well, thanks, everybody. Special thanks to you panelists. Juan Ramirez of the Racist Sandwich podcast, which everyone should definitely listen to. Emilly Prado, freelance journalist, photographer, and DJ. And if you do listen to the Racist Sandwich podcast, you should definitely listen to Emily's interview with Carmen Maria Machado. And Ashley Duchemin, who produces the Bitch Media podcasts, Propaganda and Backtalk, which often do cover food, and Solejo from the Racist Sandwich podcast. So yeah, it's just one big happy family of excellent food podcasts. Today's episode was recorded in the high-fiber, protein-packed city of Portland, Oregon, in the studios of OPB. You can read all about us on the OPB website. Our editor is Alex Ward. Special thanks to today's sound technician, Zach Carver. And our theme music was performed by the incomparable wine importer, Kermit Lynch. If you like our James Beard Award-winning show, please help us out. Rate us on iTunes, subscribe to The Four Top on your favorite podcast app, and please tell your friends about us. You can tweet us at @4top, check out our Instagram, or visit our Facebook page and post your thoughts about the show. We would love to hear from you. Bye-bye.
Nuit blanche, nuit blanche, nuit blanche.